too much noise today. I just need the road, the rain, and the hum of the engine.
Have you ever felt like there's a part of you don't really understand? Like, you're not sure who you really are anymore? I've been there too. Let me share something with you. Maybe it'll help you see things a little clearer. You ever notice how some of the most beautiful people you know seem to be the loneliest? It sounds strange to say out loud, almost like it breaks some invisible rule that beauty should naturally come with love, connection, belonging. But I've seen it too many times to believe that's always true. And I've felt it too. Not in the same way, maybe, but close enough to recognize the signs. That look in someone's eyes when they walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention, yet somehow seem 1,000 miles away. There's something about being seen by everyone and understood by no one that can feel deeply isolating. I have a friend. Let's call her Lila. She turns heads wherever she goes. People compliment her constantly, but when we talk, really talk, she often says they don't see me. Not really. And it's not bitterness in her voice, it's grief. The quiet kind, the kind that sits with you late at night when the noise fades. Lila once told me that she used to think something was wrong with her. How can I be admired by so many, she asked, but still feel so invisible? That question haunted her for years. She tried everything, different looks, different friends, even therapy. But nothing really clicked until she started digging into the deeper stuff. The parts of her that weren't about how she looked, but about how she was seen and what people projected onto her. That's where things got interesting. Because it wasn't just about her. It was about all of us. The way we unconsciously create stories about people before we know them. And the more beautiful someone appears on the outside, the more tempting it is to fill in the blanks with fantasies, fears, insecurities, all our own unspoken stuff. We don't do it to be cruel. It's just human. But imagine being on the receiving end of that every single day. People falling in love with an idea of you, not you. Friends who assume your life is easy. Strangers who treat you like a symbol, a muse, a prize, a standard. And you're in there somewhere, trying to be heard over the noise. When Lila started reading about Carl Jung and the concept of projection, something shifted. She told me it was like seeing the world through a different lens. Jung believed we all carry unconscious material, things we don't want to face, and that we often project those things onto others, especially people who evoke strong feelings in us. Beauty, it turns out, is one of the strongest triggers for projection. It brings up our longings, our inadequacies, our idealizations. When a woman walks into a room and she's stunning, she becomes a canvas. People paint their desires and insecurities all over her. Some assume she's arrogant. Others fall silent in her presence, convinced they're not enough. And very few actually take the time to ask, who is she really? Lila said the hardest part wasn't being misunderstood. It was being misseen. The way people looked at her wasn't neutral. It was loaded. And sometimes, even their admiration felt heavy, like it came with expectations she didn't ask for. She felt like she had to perform, to fit the image others created, or else be dismissed entirely. And that kind of pressure, it's exhausting. It wears you down in places no one else sees. We had this long conversation once, just the two of us on a quiet evening. She asked me, have you ever felt like people love you for what you represent, not who you are? And I had to pause, because in my own way, I felt that. Maybe not because of beauty, but because of roles, the good listener, the strong one, the achiever. It's a similar ache. When your identity becomes a reflection of someone else's needs, your real self starts to slip out of reach. I think that's why this story matters. Because it's not just about Lila or about beautiful women being lonely. It's about all of us learning to see each other more clearly, without the filters, without the assumptions. It's about catching ourselves when we turn someone into a symbol instead of meeting them as a soul. And maybe, just maybe, it starts with how we look at ourselves. What do we project? What do we want to face? Who we turned into ideals because it felt safer than seeing the full truth. These questions aren't easy, but they're worth sitting with. Because behind every image, behind every perfect smile or curated exterior, there's a real human being hoping, just like you, to be loved for who they are. And that changes everything. I remember when Lila first told me that she felt like a prisoner of her own appearance. I didn't understand at first. How could someone who embodied what so many people chase, beauty, admiration, presence, feel trapped? But the more we talked, the more I saw it. The beauty that others worshipped had become a wall she couldn't climb down from. It wasn't just that people misread her, it was that they didn't even try to read her at all. It's strange, isn't it? How something the world celebrates can quietly turn into something that isolates you. Lila said she often felt like she was playing a role written by someone else. Not because she wanted to, but because that role came with being seen as beautiful. People imagined her to be confident, aloof, maybe even demanding. But underneath all that, she was just a woman who wanted to be known, to be spoken to gently, not cautiously, to be loved deeply, not admired from a distance. She once told me about a date she went on. The guy seemed decent enough, charming, curious, even a bit nervous. But the entire time, he kept complimenting her looks. "You're so perfect," he said more than once. And Lila? She smiled politely, but inside she was screaming. Not because she hated compliments, but because she knew he wasn't seeing her. He was caught up in some image, some fantasy. When she talked about her childhood or her insecurities, his eyes glazed over. She could feel the emotional disconnect, as if he was still trying to maintain the illusion. That night, she came home and cried. "I don't want to be perfect," she told me. "I want to be real, messy, honest, and still loved." It was the first time I heard her say it out loud. The exhaustion of being an ideal instead of a human. Carl Jung had a term for this, the archetype of the muse. It's this ancient, almost sacred idea of a woman who inspires others, who stirs creativity, desire, or transformation, but is rarely allowed to just be. The muse isn't supposed to be vulnerable. She isn't supposed to break down or need help. She exists as a mirror for someone else's emotions, not her own. And Lila had become that without ever choosing it. You could see it in the way people spoke to her, always a little too carefully, like they were rehearsing their words, trying to impress or prove something. They weren't talking with her. They were talking at the version of her they created in their minds. It made her retreat, slowly but steadily. She started saying less in conversations, smiling more, nodding more, but revealing less. Not because she didn't want to be known, but because it hurt too much to keep being misunderstood. And it's not just the admiration that becomes a burden. It's a judgment, too. If she's single, people assume she must be difficult or picky or emotionally unavailable. "You must intimidate men," they say, as if that's her fault. No one ever asks if maybe, just maybe, she's been chasing something deeper and hasn't found it yet. That's the part that stings the most, I think. The way society builds a pedestal and then resents you for standing on it. She's praised for her appearance, but if she enjoys that praise too openly, she's called vain. If she downplays it, she's seen as false modest. There's no winning. And all the while, the real Lila, the thoughtful, funny, wounded, wise Lila, is left waiting behind the curtain. There's a quote I once read. "To be loved but not known is comforting but shallow. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved, well, that's a lot like being seen by God." That's what Lila wanted. What we all want, really. But when the world keeps looking at you through the lens of an archetype, not a person, you start to feel like maybe the love you crave is a fairy tale. Maybe you're asking for too much. And yet, I don't think it's too much. I think it's the bare minimum. Lila started to shift when she realized that her value wasn't something tied to how she looked or even how others perceived her. It was something she had to claim from within. That realization didn't make her any less beautiful, but it made her more whole. She began drawing boundaries. saying no to relationships that didn't meet her at her depth, letting go of friendships that only orbited around her appearance. And most importantly, she started allowing herself to be messy, to cry in front of people, to talk about her fears, to stop apologizing for needing more than attention, for needing truth. It was beautiful to witness, because in shedding the archetype of the muse, she began reclaiming her story. She wasn't here to inspire others through illusion. She was here to be real, to be seen, to be met. And that, my friend, is the kind of beauty that doesn't fade. The kind that transforms not just how others see you, but how you finally see yourself. There's something incredibly subtle and painful that happens when you start to realize people aren't actually connecting with you. They're connecting with a version of you they've built in their own minds. It doesn't matter how much time you spend with them, how many stories you share, or how open you try to be. You can feel the invisible filter between you. It's like your real self is behind glass. That's exactly what Lila began to describe more and more. The further she went into her own self-reflection, the more she saw how these projections had shaped her relationships, and not just with men, but with friends, colleagues, even strangers. It was like every person who looked at her wasn't just seeing her. They were seeing themselves, or more specifically, their insecurities, fantasies, wounds, and hopes reflected back at them. She wasn't a mirror by choice. She was made into one. Carl Jung described this phenomenon in a way that's hard to forget. Projection is when we see in others the things we've buried in ourselves. That means the more unresolved stuff someone carries, the more likely they are to project it, especially onto someone who stands out. And beauty, well, beauty is a spotlight. It illuminates everything, including what others don't want to see in themselves. I remember Lila saying something that really stuck with me. She said, "Sometimes I feel like people are in love with the idea of being with someone like me, not actually being with me." That broke my heart because I knew how much she longed for something real, for someone to reach beyond the idea and into the truth of her. But the truth is complicated, not just hers, but everyone's. Because projection is a two-way street. And the part that most people overlook is that even beautiful women, even someone like Lila, can carry their own projections, their own ghosts. She told me that for a long time, she believed that love would always be shallow, that people would only ever want her because of how she looked. It wasn't just something she feared, it was something she had absorbed, internalized. When you hear the same message over and over again, even if it's unspoken, it sinks in. And so she built defenses. Not walls exactly, but quiet ways of protecting herself. Not texting back too quickly, keeping conversations light, never getting too vulnerable on the first few dates. It was like she had a script she followed to avoid being disappointed, to keep herself from hoping too much. She would sometimes pick partners who were emotionally unavailable, or who confirmed her belief that deep love just wasn't possible for someone like her. At least not without having to constantly question whether it was real, whether she was being loved or just looked at. It's easy to forget that even admiration can be a form of dehumanization. When you're always being told how beautiful you are, it starts to feel like that's all you're allowed to be. And when people don't ask about your fears, your pain, your childhood, your dreams, you begin to wonder if those parts of you are even worth knowing. That's when Lila started asking the harder questions. Not just, why am I always attracting the wrong kind of attention? But, what part of me still believes that's all I deserve? She wasn't blaming herself. She was waking up, realizing that somewhere along the way, she had learned to expect surface-level love, because that's what the world kept offering her. And this is where Jung's concept of the shadow came into play. The shadow isn't just our darkness. It's the parts of ourselves we hide, suppress, or refuse to acknowledge. For Lila, the shadow wasn't about arrogance or vanity. It was about the belief that she couldn't be loved for her full self, that maybe she wasn't deep enough, interesting enough, worthy enough beyond her looks. Uncovering that was painful, but also freeing, because once she saw it, she could choose something different. She didn't have to live from that script anymore. She started being honest in ways that scared her. On dates, she began to share more about her doubts, her family wounds, her sense of loneliness. Sometimes that honesty pushed people away, but sometimes it drew the right people closer. And that's the strange and beautiful thing about shadow work. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about reclaiming the parts of you you were told didn't matter. For Lila, it was reclaiming her humanity, letting go of the idea that she had to be perfect to be loved, that she had to perform a role to be accepted. The more she did this, the more she began to see through other people's projections, too. She became more compassionate, not just toward others, but toward herself. She saw that men who idolized her were often terrified of intimacy, that friends who envied her were often hurting in ways they couldn't admit. And instead of shrinking to make others comfortable, she began to stand in her truth, not with arrogance, but with presence. It's not that the projection stopped. People still saw what they wanted to see, but now she could tell the difference. And more importantly, she no longer let those projections define her. There's a kind of quiet power in that, a kind of freedom that doesn't shout, but simply is. And watching Lila grow into that, into herself, reminded me that we all carry shadows. We all carry stories. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop living inside someone else's story and start writing our own. You know, when Lila really began to change, it wasn't loud. There was no big declaration, no dramatic rebirth. It was subtle, like watching someone slowly come back into their body after years of drifting just above it. And at first, she didn't even realize what was happening. It was just this growing discomfort with the conversations she used to tolerate, the relationships she used to entertain, the roles she used to play. She told me one day, over coffee, that she was starting to feel a strange kind of aloneness. Not because she was lonely, but because she couldn't unsee what she now saw. That once you've started the journey of waking up to yourself, it becomes hard to stay asleep in your interactions. Small talk feels hollow. Performative affection feels abrasive. Being desired is no longer enough. You want to be met. That's when it clicked for me. Awareness, while beautiful, can also be incredibly isolating. Carl Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." An awakening is not always a peaceful experience. Sometimes it means seeing the ways you've been complicit in your own silence. Sometimes it means grieving the version of yourself that tried so hard to be lovable by being less than whole. For Lila, this awareness brought both clarity and sorrow. She could no longer pretend that the connections she had were enough. She could no longer be content with being admired if it came at the cost of being understood. And so, the shedding began. She distanced herself from people who couldn't hold space for her truth. She stopped replying to messages that were only about her appearance. She let go of relationships that felt transactional, where she offered warmth, depth, presence, and received only validation in return. And yes, it got quiet, uncomfortably so. There were days when she doubted herself, wondered if she was being too picky, too sensitive, too demanding. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about having high standards. This was about finally honoring the depth she always carried but rarely showed. There's a strange paradox here. The more authentic you become, the fewer people can meet you there. Not because you're unlovable, but because true intimacy requires courage. It demands that we strip away our masks, our projections, our defenses. And not everyone is ready for that kind of exposure, to themselves or to another. Lila used to tell me she felt lonelier in a crowded room than when she was actually alone. Now, for the first time, being alone felt clean, like silence with integrity. She said, "I'd rather sit with my own truth than be surrounded by people who only want a piece of my surface." And that takes strength. You see, when you've been conditioned to derive your worth from how others respond to you, especially through beauty, choosing solitude can feel like rebellion. It's going against everything you were rewarded for. But in that rebellion, something sacred is born. Not the kind of confidence that's performative or curated. The kind that sits inside your bones and says, "I am enough, even here, even in this stillness." It reminded me of something else Jung said. Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. That's the ache Lila had been carrying for years. Not the absence of people, but the absence of being known. But with every step she took away from false intimacy, she stepped closer to herself. She began to explore parts of her personality that had long been dormant. Her creativity, her anger, her curiosity. She started journaling, painting, walking without music just to hear her own thoughts. She discovered that there was a whole world inside her that had been muted beneath the pressure to be pleasing. And slowly, something shifted. She stopped asking, "Why doesn't anyone see me?" and started asking, "Do I see me?" And when the answer finally became yes, when she began to feel rooted in her own being, she stopped chasing, stopped auditioning, stopped waiting for someone to rescue her from her solitude. She wasn't bitter. She was awake. There's a softness that comes with that kind of self-knowledge. Not the softness of submission, but the softness of someone who no longer needs to defend their worth. And in that softness, there's power. Real, grounded, radiant power. People began to notice. Not because she was trying to be noticed, but because there's something magnetic about a person who's no longer pretending. Her presence became less about the beauty that everyone could see and more about the depth that few could touch. She still had moments of doubt, still craved connection, still hoped to be loved. But now, those hopes were no longer desperate. They were quiet, steady, patient, rooted not in lack, but in knowing. She had become someone who could sit with herself, in silence, in longing, in joy, and feel whole. And that, I think, is the most intimate relationship any of us can ever have. There was this evening, quiet, soft, a little heavy, when Lila looked at me and said, "You know what's funny? I used to think that if I became everything they wanted, I'd finally feel loved. But now, I realize that becoming everything I am is the only thing that's ever brought me peace." She meant it. You could hear in her voice, not the bravado of someone trying to sound wise, but the trembling kind of honesty that only comes after you've walked through fire. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just real. But real doesn't always mean comfortable. In fact, as Lila began to shed the roles she used to wear, the accommodating beauty, the woman who made others feel validated just by being beside them, she began to feel the cost of it all. She lost people. Friends drifted. Conversations that once came easy now felt forced. Dating, which had once been full of energy and possibility, now felt like navigating a minefield of projections and masks. It wasn't that people were bad. Most weren't. But many were still playing the same game she had left behind. One where image ruled over essence, where desire disguised itself as love, and where connection was more about chemistry than depth. Lila had changed, and the world around her hadn't quite caught up. I remember her telling me about this guy she met. On paper, he was everything. Intelligent, successful, emotionally aware. But as they talked, she noticed the way he kept circling back to her appearance, even when the conversation had nothing to do with it. He complimented her eyes when she shared something painful. He praised her smile when she talked about past betrayal. And slowly, that familiar ache returned. The ache of being reduced to a symbol just when she was trying to be most human. That night, she sat in her car after the date and cried. Not because he was cruel, but because even someone who should have known better couldn't see beyond the mask. "It's like I'm shouting in a language no one speaks," she said. That's the loneliness of transformation. When you begin to choose yourself, not the curated version, but the raw, aching, luminous truth of who you are. Not everyone can follow. And that can feel devastating at first, because we want to belong. We want to be loved. But eventually, you stop wanting to be loved by everyone. You start longing to be loved right. And that was the shift. Lila stopped interpreting solitude as punishment. She began to see it as refinement, as a quiet place where she could hear herself clearly, where she could remember what she longed for, not what others expected. It wasn't about superiority or distance. It was about integrity. She couldn't pretend anymore, not even a little. But here's the thing. Most people are still asleep. Not because they're lazy or broken, just because waking up is hard. It's painful, and not everyone is ready to face the illusions that have made them feel safe for so long. That's why genuine intimacy is rare, because it requires two people who are both awake and willing to stay awake even when it hurts. So Lila waited. She stopped rushing into connections. She gave herself permission to grieve the fantasy of what she used to think love was. And instead of settling, she made space, deep, honest, spacious room for something real. That space scared people. It made some uncomfortable. There were men who disappeared when she didn't flirt back. Friends who grew distant when she stopped being the easy one. But Lila was no longer interested in being digestible. She wanted to be known. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that privilege, it costs. It costs illusion. It costs popularity. It costs comfort. But what you gain is irreplaceable. Lila began to glow differently. Not in a way you could photograph or post about, but in a way you could feel. Her laughter came slower, deeper. Her eyes didn't dart for approval anymore. She moved through the world like someone who knew she belonged, not because others said so, but because she had claimed herself. And that kind of presence, it's magnetic. The right people began to find her. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. People who weren't threatened by her depth, who didn't need her to shrink, who saw her not as a prize, but as a partner, who stayed not because they were enchanted by the image, but because they were moved by the soul. And isn't that what we're all really looking for? Not just someone who wants us, but someone who meets us, all of us. Even the messy, uncertain, imperfect parts. Especially those. Lila used to ask, "Why do I feel so alone?" But now, she started asking something else. Who can meet me in this truth? And that, my friend, is where the story really begins. There's something sacred about choosing to see clearly, about no longer playing along with illusions just because they feel familiar or safe. But it's also one of the loneliest choices a person can make. That was the space Lila had stepped into. Not bitterness, not resentment, but a kind of solitude that comes when you're no longer willing to accept less than what's true. She told me once, "I'd rather be alone in truth than surrounded in illusion." And I believed her because I'd seen the cost. I'd seen her walk away from the kind of affection most people would chase. I'd watched her turn down attention that was flattering but hollow. Because she wasn't interested in being desired anymore. She wanted to be seen. And here's the thing no one tells you. When you start living like that, the world doesn't applaud. In fact, it often grows quieter. People pull back, not out of malice, but because many are still addicted to their projections, to loving images rather than people. And when you stop playing the part, they don't know what to do with you. But Lila didn't flinch. She felt the ache, of course. There were moments when she wondered if maybe she was asking too much, if maybe she was destined to always walk this path alone. But underneath the ache was something deeper, something like peace. Because for the first time in her life, she was choosing herself. And not in some surface level, Instagram quote kind of way. I mean in the raw, uncompromising, soul level way. The kind of self-choosing that meant she no longer bent herself into shapes just to be loved. The kind that meant she stopped performing. The kind that meant she was willing to wait, however long it took, for a connection that saw her in her entirety. Jung talked about individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating every part of ourselves, including the ones we've rejected or ignored. That's what Lila was doing. She was no longer dividing herself into palatable pieces. She was reclaiming her fullness, her sadness, her intensity, her wisdom, her softness, her sexuality, her fear. And that scared people, because realness does that. We live in a world obsessed with masks. We scroll past thousands of curated lives, compare ourselves to filtered versions of reality, fall in love with images more often than with people. But when someone steps forward without a mask, when they say, "Here I am, all of me," it forces others to confront their own illusions. Not everyone's ready for that, but some are. One day, Lila met someone different. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't sweep her off her feet. It was quiet, grounded, almost unremarkable at first. But something about him felt still. He wasn't trying to impress her. He didn't fill the silences with charm. He asked questions that surprised her. He listened, not to reply, but to understand. And he didn't flinch when she showed him her truth. It wasn't perfect. No fairy tales here. They stumbled. They triggered each other. But the difference was they stayed. They kept showing up, not for the version of each other that was easy to love, but for the one that was real. The one with shadows and doubts and dreams too big to fit into small talk. And for Lila, that was everything. Because for the first time, she wasn't being idolized or pursued or performed for. She was being met, fully, without projections, without illusions. Just a woman and a man, both doing the work of seeing and being seen. She told me later, it's not that he made me whole. It's that I was already whole, and he didn't ask me to shrink. That, I think, is the essence of true love. Not two halves completing each other, but two wholes walking beside one another, holding space for both the light and the shadow. But Lila's story isn't just about romantic love. It's about the quiet revolution that happens when a person stops chasing external validation and starts living from inner truth. When they realize that beauty isn't what makes them worthy, wholeness is. She still gets attention. People still stare. But now, she doesn't mistake that for love. She knows the difference. And because she knows the difference, she's no longer hungry for what's empty. That's the gift of the journey. It doesn't guarantee ease. It doesn't promise you'll be surrounded by people who get it. But it gives you something far more powerful, clarity. And with clarity comes freedom. Lila used to be seen by everyone and known by no one. Now, even if only a few truly know her, she is no longer unknown to herself. And that changes everything. There was a time, not so long ago, when Lila would have called this season of her life loneliness. But now she calls it space. The space to grow, to feel, to choose, not from fear or habit, but from alignment. She doesn't crave the spotlight anymore, not the way she used to. Now, she craves quiet eyes, safe touch, honest words, the kind of love that whispers instead of shouts. But here's the hard truth she came to accept. Not everyone is ready for that kind of love. Some people want the performance. They want the perfection, the fantasy, the highlight reel. They aren't trying to hurt you. They just haven't yet faced themselves deeply enough to meet someone else in their fullness. They want beauty without shadow, light without heat, connection without depth. Lila stopped waiting for those people to catch up. She started walking her path anyway, and sometimes that meant walking alone. But now, she does it with her head held high, not out of pride, but out of wholeness. She knows what she's made of. She knows what she carries. And she knows she will not offer that to anyone who can't see her clearly. That is not arrogance. That is dignity. She told me recently, I'm not lonely because no one loves me. I'm lonely because so few people know how to love fully. And then she smiled, not sadly, not bitterly, but with that quiet power she's come to wear so well. But I'd rather be alone with my truth than surrounded by people who only want the illusion. This, I believe, is the revolution. Because Lila is not just one woman. She's a mirror for so many of us. Those who've been misunderstood, flattened into roles, idolized but never held. She represents the journey of all who have chosen to stop performing and start living. And yes, that journey is hard. Yes, it costs you things, approval, comfort, certainty. But it also gives you something holy, yourself. That's what Jung meant, I think, when he said the most difficult journey is the journey within. It's not glamorous. It's not always beautiful. But it's yours. And it's real. Lila still hopes for love. Of course she does. But now her hope is grounded. It's not desperate, not idealistic. She no longer waits for someone to complete her. She waits for someone willing to meet her. Fully, bravely, without flinching. And maybe that's rare. Maybe it takes time. But now she has time. Because she's not running anymore. Not chasing, not proving, not shrinking. She's rooted, steady, awake. She no longer asks, why am I alone? She asks, who is ready to walk beside me? Not ahead or behind, but here, in the honesty, in the rawness, in the depth. And until that person comes, she's okay. More than okay. Because she's no longer a symbol. No longer a mirror. No longer just the muse in someone else's story. She's her own story now. And it's breathtaking. Not because it's perfect, but because it's true. If this felt meaningful to you, it might mean something to someone else too. So hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. That's how YouTube knows to share it with others. Maybe together, we can help someone see things a little differently.